The mahogany gavel hovered in the frigid air of a New York courtroom, a symbol of absolute authority. Yet Judge Julian Thorne's hand began to tremble. In the prisoner S-box stood a young man with eyes like shards of familiar glass eyes Julian had unseen in 2 decades. The gavel fell, but the sound was a death knell for his secrets. The boy he abandoned wasn't just a face in the crowd. He was the defendant, facing the very man who broke him. Beyond the high windows of the Justice Hall, the city of Manhattan breathed in rhythmic exhales of gray smoke, indifferent to the silent explosion occurring within the judge's fractured soul. The morning in Lower Manhattan was not merely cold. It was predatory. A thick, oppressive fog had rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the jagged peaks of the skyscrapers and turning the bustling streets into a labyrinth of shadows and muted sirens. Inside the Supreme Court building, the air was different. It was sterile, heavy with the scent of floor wax, old paper, and the invisible weight of 1,000 desperate prayers. Judge Julian Thorne moved through the hallowed corridors with a rhythmic, sovereign grace. His footsteps, polished leather against marble, echoed like the ticking of a grandfather clock. Precise, inexorable, and utterly devoid of mercy, Julian was a man carved from the very stone of the institution he served. At 62, his face was a map of disciplined lines, his hair a distinguished silver that caught the flickering fluorescent light of the hallways. To the world, he was the embodiment of the law-unflinching objective, and perhaps a little too cold. He entered his private chambers, the sanctuary, where he prepared for the day's docket. The room was lined with leather-bound volumes of jurisprudence, their spines cracked from decades of consultation. He reached for his judicial robe, the heavy black silk feeling like a second skin, or perhaps a shroud. As he pulled the fabric over his shoulders, he felt the familiar pull of the weight. It was the weight of judgment. It was the weight of a man who had spent 30 years deciding the fates of others while meticulously burying his own. He paused before the mahogany-framed mirror, adjusting his silk tie with fingers that were usually as steady as a surgeon's. But today there was a microscopic twitch in his left eyelid, a subtle rebellion of the nerves. He ignored it. He took a sip of lukewarm espresso, the bitter liquid coating his tongue like a dark premonition. He thought of his life as a series of closed files, each one neatly labeled and shelved. There was no room for the messy, the emotional, or the unresolved. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a glass fortress where the only sound was the soft hum of the climate control. He was a man of logic, a man of the state. The clock struck 9. The bailiff's voice drifted through the door, a muffled command that signaled the start of the session. Julian stepped into the courtroom. The room was a cathedral of justice, with vaulted ceilings and rows of benches filled with the weary, the worried, and the cynical. He ascended the bench, his presence instantly commanding a hush that felt like a held breath. He looked down at the documents before him, the white pages glaring under the harsh lights. Case number 402, Be the People versus Elias Vance. A routine felony charge, grand larceny. A botched robbery in a Soho warehouse. Julian had seen 1,000 cases like it. Desperate men doing desperate things, in a city that had no room for the weak. "Bring in the defendant," Julian commanded, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled the chamber like a rolling tide. The side door creaked open. It was a small, agonizing sound, the protest of rusted metal against the silence. 2 guards led a young man toward the wooden enclosure. He was thin, his frame hidden beneath a tattered, oversized coat that looked as though it had been salvaged from a rain-slicked alley. His hair was dark and matted, and his posture was one of defiant exhaustion. But as he reached the center of the room, he lifted his head. The air in Julian's lungs suddenly turned to lead. The young man's eyes were not the eyes of a stranger. They were a piercing, haunting shade of amber, the exact color of the Seattle sunset Julian had watched 20 years ago, the night he walked out of a small apartment and never looked back. The boy's jawline was a mirror image of Julian's own in his youth, sharp, stubborn, and etched with a hidden vulnerability. The room began to tilt. The sounds of the courtroom, the scratching of a court reporter's pen, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of paper faded into a high-pitched ring. Julian stared. He didn't just see a criminal, he saw a ghost. He saw the woman he had left behind, Sarah, with her tired smiles and her unwavering belief that he would return. He saw the letters he had never opened, the photographs he had burned in a fit of ambitious cleansing. This boy, Elias, was approximately 24 years old. The math was a cruel, undeniable blade. Julian felt a cold sweat break across his brow, hidden by the shadow of his judicial bench. His heart, usually a steady drum, began to thrash against his ribs, like a trapped bird. He looked at the charge sheet again, his vision blurring. Elias Vance. Vance had been Sarah's maiden name. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a silent, internal earthquake that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed world. He was sitting in judgment of the life he had discarded. He was looking at the consequences of his own cowardice, dressed in rags and shackled in iron. Elias looked up, his gaze meeting Julian's. For a heartbeat, there was no judge and no defendant, only a father and a son across a chasm of 20 years. Elias didn't seem to recognize him. To the boy, Julian was just another cog in the machine that was designed to crush him. But Julian knew, every fiber of his being screamed the truth. The sterile air of the courtroom suddenly felt thick with the scent of old regrets, the biting ozone of a storm that had been brewing for 2 decades. Julian's hand moved toward the gavel, a reflex to regain control, but his fingers only brushed the wood. He couldn't speak. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing, a suffocating presence that the gallery began to notice. The prosecutor cleared his throat, a sharp, inquisitive sound. Julian forced himself to breathe. He had to maintain the mask. He had to be the judge. But as he looked at the boy's scarred knuckles and the hollows beneath his eyes, a singular, terrifying thought took root in his mind. I didn't just leave him, I created this. The trial had not even begun, yet Julian felt the verdict already weighing on his soul. The atmosphere was no longer just cold, it was haunted. The microscopic details of the room, the way a single dust mote danced in a shaft of light. The rhythmic tapping of a spectator's foot became agonizingly vivid. He was no longer the architect of justice. He was a prisoner of his own history. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B shifted, the air thickening until it felt like inhaling damp wool. The rhythmic, mechanical whirring of the overhead ventilation system became a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the soles of Julian's shoes. He sat motionless, his spine a rigid pillar of ancient, calcified pride. Yet beneath the heavy silk of his robe, his skin felt clammy, filmed with a cold, translucent sweat that spoke of a body in revolt. Marcus Sterling, the prosecution's lead attorney, rose from his seat with a calculated, predatory elegance. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, its fabric whispering against the leather of his chair, a sound that, to Julian's hypersensitized ears, was as loud as a gunshot in a canyon. Sterling cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed too great against the very silence of the room, and adjusted the knot of his silk tie with fingers that moved with practiced, rhythmic precision. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice a polished weapon, "the facts of this case are as unremarkable as they are tragic." Julian wanted to scream, to interrupt the flow of the man's clinical arrogance, but his tongue felt like a heavy, leaden weight. He was a prisoner of his own black robe, an icon of justice, forced to witness the systematic dismantling of his own flesh and blood. Sterling moved toward the jury box, his footsteps echoing on the parquet floor like the ticking of an executioner's watch. He began to recount the night of September 14th, 3 a.m, a warehouse in Soho. Julian found himself obsessing over the smallest, most agonizing details. Rain had been falling that night, a cold, relentless Manhattan drizzle that turned the pavement into a mirror of neon and grime. Julian imagined Elias, standing in that rain, the biting ozone scent of the storm filling his lungs, his thin frame shivering beneath that tattered, oversized coat. The prosecutor gestured toward a technician, and the courtroom lights dimmed. The sudden darkness was a mercy, hiding the tremor in Julian's hands. But the flickering glow of the monitors was a new kind of torture. Exhibit A, Sterling announced. The screen flickered to life, presenting a grainy, monochromatic world of shadows and light. There was Elias. The resolution was poor, a mosaic of gray pixels, yet Julian could see the raw desperation in the way the boy moved, the frantic bird-like jerks of his head as he scanned the alleyway, the way he fumbled with the rusted lock of the warehouse door. It wasn't the choreography of a professional criminal. It was the movement of a man who had reached the absolute, jagged edge of his existence. Julian watched his son's face, his own face, 20 years younger, illuminated by the sudden, blue-white flash of a security light. In that moment, Elias looked like a ghost, an apparition summoned from the depths of Julian's suppressed memory to demand an accounting. The guilt was no longer a dull, manageable ache. It was a sharp, piercing needle that found every nerve ending in Julian's body. He remembered Sarah's hands, those soft, resilient hands that had always smelled of lavender and cheap dish soap. He remembered how those hands had gripped his sleeve as he stood by the door of their cramped, drafty apartment in Seattle. "Don't go, Julian," she had whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the silence of the night. He had told himself then that he was doing it for her, for the child, for the greater good, that a man of his vast intellectual potential was destined for the highest courts of the land, not a life of domestic mediocrity and stifled dreams. He had convinced himself that she would be better off without the burden of his ambition. He had lied to himself for 7,000 days, and now the lie was standing in a prisoner's box, facing 25 years to life under the state's uncompromising sentencing laws. The defense attorney, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, stood up. She was young, her eyes burning with a fire that Julian realized had long since flickered out in his own soul. She spoke of mitigating circumstances, her voice trembling with a sincere, desperate heat. She spoke of a mother who had died in a cramped, unheated apartment 3 years ago, a woman who had worked 3 jobs until her heart simply gave up. She spoke of a boy who had aged out of a broken foster care system, with nothing but a plastic trash bag of clothes and a profound, echoing sense of abandonment. Julian's heart constricted with such violence that he feared it might actually stop. Sarah was dead. The woman he had promised to love, the woman whose letters he had burned, was gone, and he was the one who had left her to die in the shadows. Julian squeezed his eyes shut for a second too long. The darkness behind his eyelids filled with the scent of rain and the sound of a crying infant he had never held. When he opened them, Elias was looking at him, truly looking. The boy's brow furrowed, a flicker of something shifting in those amber eyes, a ghost of a distant memory, perhaps, or a subconscious recognition of the familiar, stubborn bone structure of the man on the bench. But the moment passed, replaced quickly by a cold, hard, and jagged cynicism. To Elias, Julian was not a father. He was simply the executioner, the final barrier between a life of suffering and a life behind bars. Julian realized, with a sickening, visceral clarity, that even if he used every ounce of his power to save the boy from prison, he could never save him from the damage he had already inflicted. The suspense in the room was no longer about the verdict. It was about the crushing weight of the truth that was beginning to bleed through the cracks of Julian's composure. The clock on the back wall of the courtroom continued its rhythmic, indifferent march, click, 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 each second a heartbeat, each heartbeat a judgment. The prosecutor was finishing his opening statement, his voice rising to a crescendo of moral indignation. Julian looked down at his gavel, the heavy, polished wood glinting under the fluorescent lights. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to throw it, to break the silence, to confess his sins before the assembly. Instead, he reached for a glass of water, his fingers brushing the cold condensation. The glass rattled against his teeth, a small, crystalline sound that felt like ice breaking on a frozen lake. He was the judge. He was the law. But as he looked at Elias's son, the boy with his eyes and Sarah's Solhe, knew that he was also the man on trial. The heavy soundproofed door of Judge Julian Thorne's private chambers clicked shut with a sound like a guillotine blade sliding into its groove shirt, final and utterly devoid of mercy. Julian stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing against his eardrums with the weight of deep sea water. The only light came from a single green-shaded desk lamp, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of leather-bound law books that lined the walls like silent, judgmental witnesses. He looked at his hands, those manicured, steady hands, and watched as a fine, rhythmic tremor began to radiate from his fingertips. He walked toward the window, his footsteps muffled by the thick, crimson carpet. Outside, the New York skyline was a jagged silhouette of cold glass and steel, the lights of the city flickering like dying embers in a hearth of charcoal clouds. He thought of the law. He had dedicated 40 years to the architecture of justice, believing it to be a crystalline structure of logic and precedent. But now, that structure was shattering, its fragments cutting deep into his conscience. He reached into the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, his fingers brushing against a hidden latch. He pulled out a small, weathered envelope, only thing he had kept from his former life. Inside was a photograph, its edges yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of cedar and the passage of decades. It was Sarah, holding a newborn in the gray light of a Seattle morning. The baby's eyes were wide, curious, and filled with a terrifying, innocent expectation. Julian had looked at that photo once a year for 20 years, a secret penance he performed in the dark. Now that baby was a man in shackles, and Julian was the one holding the key. The air in the chambers felt thin, depleted of oxygen. Julian closed his eyes and could almost feel the phantom spray of the Pacific Ocean, the salt air that had once filled his lungs before he traded it for the sterile metallic temps of the courtroom. He realized that every success he had achieved the prestige. The penthouse, the power, was built upon the hollowed-out remains of the family he had discarded. He was a monument to ambition, and like all monuments, he was cold and stationary. He knew what the law demanded. Elias had broken into a warehouse. The evidence was incontrovertible. A blind justice would sentence him to years of hard labor in an upstate facility. But Julian was no longer blind. His vision was painfully, agonizingly clear. He returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later. The atmosphere had shifted from tense to electrical. The gallery was a sea of blurred faces, their murmurs dying away as he ascended the bench. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He didn't look at the defense. He looked only at Elias. The boy was standing now, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a scratch in the wooden railing of the prisoner's box. Julian reached for his gavel, his fingers tracing the grain of the polished wood. The texture felt like rough sandpaper against his sensitized skin. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the microphone like a roll of distant thunder. In the matter of the people versus Elias Vance, Julian began, his voice surprisingly steady, though it felt as if it were being pulled from a deep, tectonic fault within his soul. The law is a rigid instrument. It is designed to measure the weight of an action, not the weight of a life. He paused, a long, agonizing silence that lasted for 10 seconds of absolute stillness. However, the law does not exist in a vacuum. It is served by men who are, themselves, flawed and subject to the consequences of their own histories. The prosecutor frowned, leaning forward, his pen poised over a legal pad. Julian continued, his gaze never leaving his son. This court finds that the defendant has been felled not by the law, but by the very foundations that are supposed to support a human life before the law is ever required. There are debts in this room that cannot be paid with prison time. There are absences that have created the very vacuum into which this young man fell. Julian's heart felt like it was expanding, threatening to crack his ribs. He knew that what he was about to do would end his career. The Judicial Oversight Committee would dismantle him. The press would feast on the scandal. He didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, the weight of the black robe felt light. Due to procedural irregularities in the initial search and a gross failure of the state to provide adequate counsel during the preliminary phase, Julian lied, his voice resonant with a fake but unshakable authority. This court dismisses all charges against Elias Vance. The defendant is to be released immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, a wave of sound that broke against the walls. Sterling, the prosecutor, leaped to his feet, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson, his mouth opening to protest. But Julian didn't give him the chance. He brought the gavel down not with a tentative tap, but with a thunderous, cataclysmic strike that echoed like a gunshot. Crack. The sound was the breaking of a chain. It was the sound of a man destroying his own temple to save a single soul. Julian stood up, his movements fluid and decisive. He didn't wait for the bailiff. He didn't wait for the chaos to erupt. He stepped down from the bench, his robe swishing around his ankles like the wings of a fallen angel. He walked straight toward the prisoner's box. The guards hesitated, confused by the breach of protocol. Elias stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the amber of his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrifying recognition. Julian stopped a foot away from the boy. Up close, he could see the tiny scars on Elias's forehead, the tremor in the boy's chin. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he placed it on Elias's shoulder. The contact was electric, a bridge spanning 2 decades of silence. Your mother, Sarah. She used to tell me that the rain in Seattle sounded like music, Julian whispered, his voice so low, it was intended for only one pair of ears. Elias flinched, his breath hitching in his chest. A single crystalline tear tracked through the grime on the boy's cheek. Who are you? Elias rasped, his voice a broken, jagged thing. Julian looked at him, his own eyes finally reflecting the sorrow he had buried for a lifetime. I am a man who spent 20 years learning how to be a judge, only to realize I forgot how to be a father. I cannot give you back the years, Elias, but I will spend the rest of mine trying to earn the right to stand beside you. Julian turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the robe on the back of his chair a hollow black shell. He walked out of the courtroom, out of the building, and into the gray, misty light of the New York afternoon. The fog was still there, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a clean slate. The moral of this story is a haunting reminder for us all. We often spend our lives building monuments to our success, only to find that they are hollow structures if they are built on the ruins of the people we've abandoned. Success, at the cost of your soul, is merely a well-decorated failure. You cannot outrun the echoes of your past. Eventually, the scales of life will demand a balance. If you were Julian, standing on that bench with your entire career on the line, would you have chosen the law that defined your life, or the son you had never known? Is redemption ever truly possible after 20 years of silence? Thank you for being part of this cinematic journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Gilded Scraps for more deep-form narratives that explore the human condition. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a masterpiece.